I worked in what everyone called the red room. It wasn't actually red, but the compliance office sat in the basement with crimson emergency lights that never quite turned off. My job was simple: catch the million-dollar mistakes before they became $10 million disasters. I reviewed every major decision, every budget cut, every corner someone tried to shave off. Most days, I was invisible. The executives upstairs forgot I existed until they needed someone to sign off on their plans. That invisibility kept me safe. Or so I thought. I'd been with the company for 6 years, working my way up from junior auditor to senior compliance officer. My desk was covered in spreadsheets and regulatory manuals. I knew every bylaw, every federal requirement, every clause that could save us or sink us. The red room had no windows, but I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. I liked knowing that my work mattered, even if nobody thanked me for it. My name is Maren, and this is the story of how I destroyed the man who tried to destroy me. Vance Holloway was everything I wasn't. Loud, confident, expensive. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent and drove a car that purred like a satisfied cat. He'd joined the company 3 years ago as vice president of operations, and within months, he'd made himself indispensable. Or at least, that's what he wanted everyone to believe. Vance treated safety protocols like suggestions. He viewed compliance reviews as annoying speed bumps on his road to the executive suite. His favorite phrase was "move fast and fix it later," which made my stomach turn every time I heard it. He was always chasing his next bonus, his next promotion, his next toy. I'd heard him bragging about his yacht fund during a company lunch. He actually called it that, with a straight face, while the rest of us were brown bagging leftovers. Vance saw the company as his personal piggy bank. And he saw people like me, people who actually cared about doing things right, as obstacles to be removed. I found the discrepancy on a Tuesday morning in March. $2 million gone. Not stolen, exactly, but allocated to a budget line that didn't match the regulatory requirements. Someone had approved cost cuts to the refrigeration systems in our pharmaceutical storage facility. The problem was simple. Those systems kept temperature-sensitive medicines stable. Cut corners there and people could get hurt. Worse, the federal regulators had new guidelines that went into effect in January. We were out of compliance. I spent 3 days triple-checking my numbers, running scenarios, building my case. Then I wrote a private memo to Vance. I kept it professional and clear. I explained the problem, attached the documentation, and outlined 3 possible solutions. I even volunteered to handle the regulatory filing myself if he'd just approve the budget restoration. I sent it on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, I hadn't heard back. That should have been my first warning. Vance finally responded on Tuesday. He didn't call me or email me. He showed up at my desk, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. Which, in a way, he thought he did. "Maren," he said, not quite smiling. "I got your memo. Here's the thing. We need to be team players right now. The board is watching our expenses. We can't go running to them every time we find a little paperwork issue. A little paperwork issue. $2 million and federal violations." I kept my voice steady. "Vance, this isn't about expenses. We're out of compliance. If the regulators find out before we fix it, the fines could be massive." He straightened up, his smile disappearing. "Lose the memo, Maren. Focus on being helpful instead of creating problems. Can you do that?" I stared at him. Every instinct I had was screaming, but I just nodded. "Sure, Vance." He left, satisfied. I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Vance's face, about the way he dismissed $2 million like it was pocket change. I'd seen this pattern before at my previous job. An executive makes a bad call, covers it up, and when everything explodes, they find someone lower on the chain to blame. I wasn't going to be that person. The next morning, I started what I called my shadow log. Every approval request I sent to Vance, every document I reviewed, every concern I raised, I mirrored it to a secure independent server. It was a backup system I'd set up years ago for personal projects. Nobody at the company knew about it. I time-stamped everything. I saved metadata, GPS coordinates from document edits, email headers, the works. If Vance wanted to make me disappear, I'd make sure I left a trail that couldn't be erased. It felt paranoid. It felt excessive. But my gut told me I'd need it. In early April, everything exploded. Someone leaked the story to the press. Major pharmaceutical company faces federal violation, screamed the headline. The article mentioned the refrigeration cuts, the compliance failures, and the potential $2 million fine. By noon, our stock had dropped 4%. By the end of the day, the board had called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I heard about it. The board was furious. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone's head on a platter. Vance went into crisis mode. He held meetings behind closed doors. He brought in lawyers. He started building his defense, and I could feel the target forming on my back. The entire executive floor was in chaos, but down in the red room, I kept working. I documented everything. I backed to my backups. And I waited. It happened on a Friday afternoon. I was reviewing a contract when Vance stormed into the red room with half the executive team behind him. He didn't bother closing the door. He wanted an audience. Maren. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. What the hell did you do? I stood up slowly. I don't know what you mean. The federal violation. The press leak. You've been sitting down here making decisions without authorization, approving budget cuts you had no business touching. My blood went cold. He was lying. He was lying, and he knew I couldn't prove it. Not right here, not right now. Vance, I never approved those cuts. I warned you about them. You're fired. Gross negligence. Security will escort you out. The room spun. I looked at the other executives, but they wouldn't meet my eyes. This was a public execution, and they were all complicit. You can't just, I can and I did. Get out of my building. Security appeared within minutes. They were polite, but firm. I had 15 minutes to pack my personal items. No access to my computer. No time to download files. They'd thought of everything. As I carried my box through the office, people stared. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked away. Vance was waiting by the elevator, smirking. As the security guard called the elevator, Vance leaned in close enough that only I could hear. Nobody believes the girl in the basement, Maren. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. Good luck with the unemployment line. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, clutching my box. And as the doors closed, I saw Vance laughing with his assistant. He thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, shaking. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the company handbook. I'd helped write it 3 years ago, when the board was updating corporate policies. There, buried in Section 14C, was the whistleblower clause. It was my baby, a protection I'd insisted on after seeing too many good people thrown under the bus. The clause was simple. Any employee terminated within 90 days of raising a compliance concern had the right to dispute their termination directly to the board. The company had to investigate before the termination became final. And during that investigation, the employee had full access to company records relevant to their dispute. Vance had fired me 38 days after my memo about the refrigeration cuts. He'd walked right into the trap. I allowed myself a small smile. Then I drove home and got to work. I didn't post on LinkedIn. I didn't call my friends to complain. I didn't do anything that would tip off Vance or his lawyers that I was planning something. Instead, I spent 48 hours in my apartment printing everything. 600 pages of timestamped documents, emails, approval requests, budget reports, and metadata logs. I organized them into 3-ring binders with color-coded tabs. I created a timeline that showed exactly who approved what and when. I highlighted every instance where I'd warned Vance about the compliance issues. Every time he'd ignored me. Every time he'd told me to be a team player. I barely slept. I lived on coffee and determination. By Sunday night, I had a case that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. And I had one more thing. The company handbook, with Section 14C highlighted and a sticky note marking the page. Monday morning, I sent one email. To Bernard Ashford, chairman of the board. Subject: formal dispute of termination under bylaw 14C. The body was 3 sentences. I am formally disputing my termination as wrongful and retaliatory under Section 14C of the company handbook. I have documentation showing that I was fired within the protected period after raising compliance concerns. I request a hearing before the full board. I attached the first 10 pages of my documentation as a preview. Then I hit send and waited. The response came within 2 hours. Mr. Ashford's assistant scheduled a board hearing for Friday at 2 p.m. I was instructed to bring all relevant documentation. Vance would be required to attend. I read the email 3 times, then closed my laptop and smiled. I heard through the grapevine that Vance was celebrating. He told his cronies that he'd handled the Maren situation and that the board was so impressed with his crisis management that they were considering him for senior vice president. He'd taken his team out for drinks on Tuesday night, bought rounds for everyone, talked about his upcoming promotion like it was already decided. His assistant told a friend, who told another friend, who told me. Vance thought I was gone. He thought I was too small, too scared, too powerless to fight back. He'd already moved someone else into my desk in the Red Room. He'd already started interviewing for my replacement. And he'd already prepared his presentation for the board, explaining how my negligence had caused the compliance crisis and how his quick action had limited the damage. He was so confident, so completely, blissfully unaware. Friday arrived. The board convened at 1:30 to review preliminary materials. I'd submitted my full documentation packet on Wednesday, giving them time to read everything before the hearing. Bernard Ashford, the chairman, was a careful man. He'd built his career on attention to detail.
I was counting on that.
At 1:45, I arrived at the executive building wearing a navy suit I'd bought specifically for this moment. It cost more than 2 months of my previous salary, and it was worth every penny. I looked like I belonged in that boardroom. I looked like someone who couldn't be ignored. Vance arrived at 1:50, flanked by 2 lawyers. He was wearing his most expensive suit, the one he saved for important presentations. When he saw me in the lobby, he froze. "What is she doing here?" One of his lawyers whispered something to him. His face went from shocked to furious in seconds. But it was too late. We were all going upstairs. The boardroom was on the 20th floor, all glass and chrome and intimidation. 12 board members sat around a massive table. Bernard Ashford sat at the head, his expression unreadable. Vance took his seat on one side of the table. I took mine on the other. "Let's begin," Bernard said. "This is a hearing under Section 14C regarding Ms. Maren's termination. Ms. Maren, you have 30 minutes to present your case." Vance leaned forward. "Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, this is a waste of the board's time. Ms. Maren was terminated for cause after her negligence led to a federal violation and a public relations disaster. We shouldn't be." "Mr. Holloway," Bernard interrupted, his voice cold. "We have an obligation to hear disputes filed under 14C. You will have your chance to respond. Sit down." Vance sat, his jaw tight. I opened my first binder. I looked directly at Vance. Let him see that I wasn't afraid anymore. "Vance," I said, my voice steady, did you not approve the budget cuts to the refrigeration line on June 12th of last year?" He laughed. Actually laughed, like I'd told a joke. "Of course not. Maren made that decision behind my back. That's why we had to terminate her. She exceeded her authority and created this entire mess." Several board members shifted in their seats. Bernard was watching me carefully. "You're saying you never approved those cuts?" I asked. "Never," Vance said firmly. "I would never authorize something that reckless. That's not how I operate." I nodded slowly, like I was considering his answer. Then I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the boardroom display. "That's interesting," I said, "because I have something I'd like to show everyone." The screen lit up with a document I'd pulled from the shadow log. It was the budget approval form for the refrigeration cuts, dated June 12th. Vance's digital signature was at the bottom, along with a timestamp, 2:47 p.m. "This is the approval form," I said. "Your signature is right there." Vance waved his hand dismissively. "That's obviously forged. Maren had access to these systems. She could have created that after the fact to cover herself." I smiled. "That's a good point." Except I also have the metadata. I clicked to the next slide. It showed the technical details of the document, when it was created, when it was modified, and most importantly, the GPS coordinates of the device that submitted the approval. According to the metadata, I explained, this approval was submitted from your laptop. And according to the GPS data, your laptop was here. I clicked again. A map appeared, with a pin dropped on a location. The Pelican Yacht Club, June 12th, 2:47 p.m. You were looking at boats, Vance. The room went silent. Every board member was staring at the screen, then at Vance, then back at the screen. Vance's face had gone pale. That doesn't prove anything, he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. GPS can be spoofed. This is all circumstantial. You're right, I agreed. Which is why I have something else. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the speaker system. On March 15th, I sent you a memo warning about the compliance issues. You came to my office on March 19th. I'm going to play you a recording of that conversation. Vance shot to his feet. You recorded me without my consent. That's illegal. Bernard held up his hand. In this state, Mr. Holloway, one-party consent is sufficient if there's reasonable suspicion of fraud or illegal activity. Sit down. Vance sat. I pressed play. My voice came through the speakers first, tinny but clear. Vance, this isn't about expenses. We're out of compliance. If the regulators find out before we fix it, the fines could be massive. Then Vance's voice, dripping with condescension. Lose the memo, Maren. Focus on being helpful instead of creating problems.
Can you do that?
I let the silence hang for a moment after the recording ended. That's called obstruction, I said quietly. Vance didn't just ignore my warning. He explicitly told me to hide evidence of a federal violation. Bernard's face was carved from stone. Mr. Holloway, why is your signature on documents you swore you never saw? Vance opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His skin had gone from pale to a sickly, translucent gray. He looked like he might pass out right there in the boardroom. Sweat was beading on his forehead. There must be my assistant. Vance grabbed onto that lifeline like a drowning man. My assistant. Melissa handles all my digital approvals. She must have submitted this without my knowledge. She had access to my accounts. She probably clicked through dozens of approvals that day without reading them carefully. This is her mistake, not mine. I glanced at the back of the room. I'd been counting on this. Melissa had been standing there quietly, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. Now she stepped forward. That's interesting, Vance, she said, her voice shaking but determined, because I have emails. Dozens of them. You specifically instructed me to fast-track those budget cuts. You said the board would never notice, and by the time anyone did, you'd have your promotion and your bonus. She held up her phone. I have screenshots. I have text messages. I have everything. Vance turned in his chair to stare at her, betrayal written across his face. You're lying. You're both lying. This is a conspiracy. But nobody was listening to him anymore. Bernard leaned back in his chair, studying Vance like he was a specimen under a microscope. Mr. Holloway, I've reviewed all of Ms. Maren's documentation. Every warning she sent you. Every time you dismissed her concerns. Every instance where you prioritized your bonus over this company's legal obligations. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I've also reviewed your expense reports. 4 trips to the Pelican Yacht Club in the past 6 months, all billed to the company as client development. Except none of those dates correspond to actual client meetings. Another board member spoke up. I've been reviewing the timeline. You approved those cuts in June. The new federal regulations went into effect in January. That means you knew we were out of compliance. You knew, and you did nothing. Vance tried to speak, but no sound came out. His face had gone beyond gray now. He looked green.
Sick.
His hands were trembling on the table. I pulled out my final piece of evidence. There's one more thing the board should know, I said. After I was fired, the board commissioned an independent audit to investigate the compliance failures. That audit is being conducted by Ashford and Associates. I paused for effect. My late grandmother left me a 30% stake in Ashford and Associates when she passed away last year. I never mentioned it because it never seemed relevant. But now that the company has hired them, I thought the board should know I'll be seeing every finding from that audit. Bernard's eyebrows went up. You own part of the auditing firm? 30%. My grandmother was a founding partner. The firm doesn't know about this hearing, and they don't know I was fired. They're conducting their audit completely independently. But yes, I'll have access to their findings. Vance made a sound like a wounded animal. Everything was crashing down around him, and he finally understood there was no way out. Bernard stood up. This hearing is concluded. The board will deliberate and announce our decision within 24 hours.
But we all knew what that decision would be.
The board dismissed us, and I gathered my binders while Vance sat frozen in his chair. As I left the boardroom, I passed Melissa in the hallway. Thank you, I said quietly. She nodded. He threw me under the bus once before. Got me written up for his mistake. I've been waiting for this. The next morning, I received an email from Bernard's office. Vance had been terminated for cause, effective immediately. Because the termination was for cause, he forfeited his $1.5 million in unvested stock options. His pension was gone. His severance package was gone. Everything he'd spent 3 years building had evaporated overnight. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, then closed my laptop and breathed deeply for the first time in weeks. The company offered me my job back, of course. They offered me Vance's old position, actually, with a 30% raise and a promise that the Red Room would get more funding and respect. I considered it for about 3 seconds. No, I told Bernard during our call. But I do want compensation for wrongful termination, and I wanted in writing that Vance's termination was for cause due to fraud and retaliation. They agreed to everything. The settlement was substantial enough that I didn't need to work for a year if I didn't want to. But I had other plans. I'd already registered my business license. Maren Compliance Solutions. My first client was the company that had just fired me. They needed someone to clean up the regulatory mess Vance had left behind, implement new protocols, and train the new vice president of operations on how to actually do the job correctly. My rate was 4 times what they'd been paying me. 2 weeks after the hearing, I was leaving a coffee shop downtown when I saw him. Vance was sitting on a bench, staring at nothing. He'd lost weight. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and he hadn't shaved. Someone had told me he'd burned through most of his savings on lawyers, trying to fight his termination. He'd lost. I could have walked past him. I should have walked past him. But something made me stop. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a penny. I walked over and dropped it in his lap. He looked up at me, confused and broken. For the yacht fund, I said. Then I walked away and didn't look back. 6 months later, my consulting firm had 12 employees and 23 corporate clients. We specialized in compliance training and regulatory audits, helping companies avoid the exact kind of disaster that had destroyed Vance. I'd been interviewed by 3 industry publications and asked to speak at 2 conferences. The Red Room was gone, replaced by a proper compliance department with windows and respect. Melissa had been promoted to executive assistant to the CEO, with a raise and a formal apology. And Vance? I heard he'd found work at a small firm across the country, making a quarter of his old salary, with no yacht club in sight. Some nights, I still thought about that moment in the boardroom, watching his face turn gray as he realized he'd lost everything. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. You can't destroy someone who knows their worth. And Vance had finally learned that lesson, though it cost him everything to do it. I'd built something real from the ashes of his arrogance, and it was worth more than all his bonuses combined.